In the Old West, the truth isn't always what it seems. Every story here is born of dust, loss, and revenge. And voices of the Old West, and this is another scar etched in the earth.
The wind howled through the barren hills of Broken Ridge, sending clouds of dust swirling across the ghostly streets. At the far end of town, past the old wooden saloon and rusted wagons, the sun began to rise, casting an eerie orange glow over the desolate land. It was a place where men fought over land, honor and power, but it was also a place where the fates of two young girls were about to intertwine. Jane, a quiet 8-year-old girl with golden hair and big, curious eyes, sat by the window of her family's farmhouse, watching the morning unfold. Her father, Thomas Andrews, had built a reputation for being a solid man of the land, respected by most, feared by a few. Little did he know his daughter's life was about to change forever. She could hear the distant thud of hooves, the approaching danger, but she didn't understand what it meant. That's when they came, a gang of outlaws led by the ruthless Jack McCarter, their eyes as cold as the desert air. They descended upon the farm like a swarm of locusts, stealing everything in sight and taking Jane. Her screams were lost to the wind as they carried her away, bound and helpless. But fate had other plans. Karai, a 10-year-old Indigenous girl from a neighboring tribe, had been living in the shadows of Broken Ridge. Raised by the land, her life had been shaped by survival. The whispers of Jane's abduction reached her ears, and without hesitation, Karai set out into the wilderness, knowing she might not return. Armed with nothing but her wits and the will to save a girl she barely knew, she ventured toward the heart of the gang's encampment. As the sun set that evening, Karai found herself face to face with Jack McCarter and his men, each of them drunk with power and cruelty. Without flinching, Karai moved like a shadow, unnoticed, until she saw Jane, pale and frightened, tied to a post. Her heart raced. She couldn't afford to waste time. In one swift motion, Karai freed Jane, pulling her into the dark shadows before anyone could notice. The escape was dangerous, and Karai's heart beat loudly in her chest as they ran through the night. Jane was too weak to keep up, her small body trembling from fear and pain. Just as they reached the edge of a cliff, Jane stumbled, and Karai could see the blood seeping from her wounds. The bandits would be on their trail soon. There was no time left. With Jane barely conscious in her arms, Karai knew she had to get the girl to safety, no matter the cost. The moon hung low over the desert as Karai trudged forward, carrying Jane in her arms, her breath heavy and strained. The wild howl of coyotes echoed in the distance, but Karai didn't stop. The harsh desert air cut at her skin, but it couldn't dull the urgency that drove her. She had to get Jane to safety. She had to protect her. Despite her exhaustion, Karai pushed on, each step bringing them closer to the land of her people. Her thoughts were a swirl of conflicting emotions: fear for Jane's life, the responsibility now resting heavily on her small shoulders, and the anger that had been building ever since they'd crossed paths with McCarter and his men. She could hear Jane's faint whimpers, each one cutting through the night like a knife. Hours passed before Karai's tribe appeared in the distance, their fires dotting the horizon like distant stars. She could hear the soft hum of drums in the air, the welcoming signs of her people. But even as relief began to settle in her chest, another thought surfaced. She knew Jane's father would come for her soon, and when he did, it would be with a debt he felt obligated to repay. As Karai entered the camp, the elders gathered around, their faces etched with concern. They took Jane from her arms, guiding the girl into a shelter where she would be cared for and tended to by the women of the tribe. Karai didn't linger. Her mind was elsewhere. She couldn't shake the feeling that she had just stepped into a dangerous game, one she wasn't sure she could control. The following morning, as the sun crept over the horizon, casting golden hues across the desert, Karai's heart sank. The distant sound of hooves approached. Thomas Andrews, he had come. The dust clouds he kicked up were visible long before he rode into the camp, his steely eyes scanning the land, searching for Karai. He was a man used to getting what he wanted, and he wanted to repay his debt. Karai met him at the edge of the camp, her posture firm but her eyes wary. Thomas didn't waste time with pleasantry. "You saved my daughter's life," he said, his voice thick with gratitude and unspoken emotion. "And for that, I can't just walk away. I have a debt to settle. I know the land you walk, Karai, and I know the dangers it hides. My daughter's life is worth more than gold to me." He paused, as though weighing the next words. "So I bring you a gift. 10 wolves. 10 of the wildest, fiercest creatures from my own ranch. They will protect you for as long as you live. You have my word." Karai's brow furrowed. A gift. The very idea made her stomach turn. She had known men like Thomas before, Men who thought they could buy protection and loyalty with things, but no one, no matter how many wolves they sent, could buy her trust. "I don't need your wolves," she replied, her voice sharp. "I didn't save your daughter for anything in return." But Thomas, relentless in his gratitude, insisted, "I understand your pride, Karai, but this is not about pride, it's about honor. My honor. And if you don't take them, then my debt will never be paid." Karai remained silent, her heart at war with itself. She didn't want to accept anything from this man, but she understood the world they lived in, a world where kindness wasn't always free, and debts, like the desert wind, couldn't be ignored. 10 wolves won't keep me safe from the world outside," Karai said quietly, turning her back to him. "You think wolves can protect me from men like Makata, from men like you?" The words stung Thomas. He had come with the best of intentions, but now he saw the depth of Karai's distrust. Still, he didn't relent. "The wolves are yours, Karai. I will leave them here. Do with them what you will." With that, he mounted his horse and turned, leaving Karai alone with his gift. The wolves were already circling the camp, their piercing eyes locking onto her, sensing the tension in the air. The decision weighed heavily on her heart. She didn't want to be beholden to anyone, least of all to the man who had raised a daughter who had been hurt by this land, by men like Makata. But the wolves, they were different. Maybe, just maybe, they could help her. But help her with what? And at what cost? The wolves sat quietly, as if waiting for her to make the next move. Karai stood there, her gaze steady and cold. "I am not a thing to be bargained for," she thought. But the wolves had no voice in the matter. They would be her companions now, whether she liked it or not. That night, as the moon rose higher in the sky, Karai lay awake, the weight of the world pressing down on her. Somewhere out there, Makata was waiting, and now, the wolves would be part of her story. The question remained, could she trust them? Could she trust Thomas? The days bled into one another, like the endless stretch of sand beneath the scorching sun. Karai and the wolves, now a constant presence in her life, moved silently across the land. Their bond had begun to form slowly, as fragile and tentative as the first flickers of dawn. The wolves, despite their ferocity, were cautious around her. Their wild eyes followed her every move, as if they, too, were trying to understand this new relationship. At first, Karai resisted their presence. She didn't need them, not their loyalty, not their protection. But as the days wore on, their silent companionship became something more. When the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the desert, the wolves would surround her, a silent guard against the dangers lurking in the dark. They were unpredictable, yes, but in a world like theirs, unpredictability was a strength. One night, Karai sat by a small fire, the flickering flames casting shadows on the faces of the wolves as they lay around her. Her mind drifted back to Jane. The girl was recovering, but the trauma of her abduction weighed heavy. Karai couldn't help but wonder if Jane would ever truly be safe again. The world they lived in, broken, brutal, and unforgiving, didn't leave much room for innocence. She didn't realize how much time had passed until the wolves suddenly rose, their heads snapping toward the horizon. Their alertness, their heightened senses were all the warning Karai needed. She didn't wait for a second sign. In an instant, she was on her feet, pulling the heavy knife from her belt. The sound of hooves on the hard earth drifted toward her ears, faint but unmistakable. Makata. She had known it was only a matter of time before he came for her, and now the time had come. The wolves began to circle her, their low growls vibrating through the air. There was no escape this time. With one final look at the campfire, the one constant in this unforgiving desert, Karai took a deep breath and moved swiftly into the night. Her heart beat heavily in her chest, but it was a steady rhythm, the pulse of survival. She knew the terrain, the land where she'd been raised. If Makata thought he could simply find her and take her down, he was wrong. She would make him regret that mistake. The wolves followed her lead, moving with an eerie, almost predatory silence, their eyes glowing in the darkness like a pack of shadows. They were one now, an extension of Karai herself, and they were ready for whatever came next. By the time Makata and his men arrived at the edge of the camp, they found nothing but a cold, empty desert, and the faintest traces of footprints leading deeper into the wilderness. They were too late. Karai had already vanished into the night, taking the wolves with her. For the next several days, Karai's world was a blur of constant motion. She was no longer just running from the dangers of Makata and his gang. Now the very land seemed to close in around her. The wolves, however, never faltered. They were with her in every step, every turn, their presence like a shield against the world's harshness. As they ventured deeper into the mountains, Karai found herself growing accustomed to the wolves. They were her guardians, her silent protectors, and for the first time since this madness began, she allowed herself to feel a small measure of safety. But no amount of protection could shield her from the inevitable. Makata wouldn't stop. He was a man driven by greed, by his need to dominate the land and everyone who stood in his way, and Karai had become his obstacle. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the desert sky turned dark with impending storm clouds, Karai felt it, the change in the air. The wolves were restless. Something was coming. A soft rustle reached her ears, followed by the unmistakable sound of hooves on the dry earth. She was no fool. She knew that Makata had finally found her, or worse, had set a trap in motion. This was no random encounter. This was the final move in a deadly game. The wolves began to growl low and menacingly, but Karai held up her hand. She had been preparing for this moment. She had spent days, weeks, moving farther and farther into the desert, hoping that her flight would confuse him, but Makata's men were relentless. "Stay close," she whispered to the wolves, Uoi. They understood her with unspoken loyalty. The pack gathered around her, instinctively forming a barrier between her and the sound of approaching danger. But the storm clouds weren't the only threat on the horizon. With a deep breath, Karai turned, making her way toward the high cliffs where she could get a better view. From the top, she saw them. Makata's men on horseback riding in a tight formation. They had tracked her down. At the edge of the cliff, she paused, her heart pounding in her chest. She wasn't going to make the same mistake again. Makata was no fool. He knew she wouldn't give up without a fight. And now they were closing in. Karai could feel the wolves tense beside her, their growls a quiet hum in the still air. She looked down at the pack. They were ready. With one final glance toward the mountains, she whispered, "It's time." The battle that was coming would test her like never before. The desert was eerily quiet as Karai descended the rocky slope, her eyes locked onto the approaching riders. She could hear the low growls of the wolves, their instincts telling them the time for retreat was over. There was no running now. The sound of hooves grew louder, closer, like the inevitable march of a storm. And with each step the wolves took, Karai's resolve grew stronger. She had long since learned to trust the land around her, the rocks beneath her feet, the wind in the air, the weight of the sun on her back. They all spoke to her in ways that others could never understand. She was a child of the wilderness, and in that moment she was ready to prove it. Her breath was steady, despite the tension coiling in her chest. The wolves moved with grace, their movements synchronized with her own, as if they too had accepted the finality of the situation. Makata and his men were not far behind. They had learned her patterns, and now they had her cornered. Karai reached the narrow ravine just as the first rider appeared at the edge. She didn't flinch. She was outnumbered, yes, but the wolves were with her, and that was enough. She signaled to the pack, and they instantly began to move, flanking her on either side, forming a protective barrier around her. The men on horseback hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to approach. Jack Makata himself appeared at the front of the group, his grim expression lighting up with recognition as he spotted Karai standing there, defiant. His eyes gleamed with cold calculation, and he dismounted, his boots scraping against the rocky ground. "I've been looking for you, girl," Makata called out, his voice a low growl that seemed to echo through the canyon. "You've cost me enough trouble. It's time to end this little game." Karai stood tall, her eyes narrowed as she met his gaze. She wasn't afraid. She hadn't been afraid for a long time. The wolves were a part of her now, and she could feel their power thrumming beneath her skin, an energy that was as raw and untamed as the desert itself. They were her strength, her shield. And today, she would make sure that Makata and his men would never take her again. The wolves, sensing the rising tension, growled louder, their fur standing on end, their bodies coiling in anticipation. Makata's men exchanged uneasy glances, unsure of whether to draw their weapons. Makata, however, remained calm. He was no fool. He had seen the way the wolves responded to Karai. They were wild, but they could be controlled. "You think those wolves can protect you?" Makata sneered, taking a step forward. "You're nothing but a little girl, hiding behind animals. The land belongs to men like me, not savages like you." Karai's jaw tightened, and without a word she stepped forward. Her hand rested on the hilt of her knife, the familiar weight grounding her. She was ready. She wasn't going to wait for him to make the first move. But before she could act, a voice called out from the distance. It was faint at first, but it was unmistakable. "Karai!" She turned sharply, her heart leaping in her chest as she recognized the voice. It was Jane. Jane, who had been recovering in the village, had followed her, against Karai's wishes. The girl was standing at the edge of the ravine, her small figure silhouetted by the fading light. In her hands, she held a rifle, though her hands were trembling with fear. Her voice, though soft, rang clear. "Don't hurt them, Karai," Jane called. "Please, don't do this." Karai's gaze flickered between Jane and Makata. The men, too, seemed frozen in time, unsure of how to react. Makata's eyes narrowed, a smirk pulling at the corner of his lips. He had seen the connection between the two girls, and now it seemed as though Jane might become his bargaining chip. "Looks like your little friend has come to save you, Karai," Makata said, his tone dripping with mockery. He took a step toward Jane, slowly, deliberately, as if testing her. "No!" Karai shouted, stepping forward in a defensive stance. The wolves, sensing the threat, moved with her, their growls rising in intensity. Makata paused, a flicker of uncertainty passing over his face. He had no intention of killing Jane, not yet anyway. He wanted her alive. She was leverage, his key to breaking Karai. "You've got a choice to make." "Karai," Makata said, his voice calm but lethal. "You can walk away, leave with me, and we'll let your little friend go. Or you can stand here, with your wolves, and watch as everything you've fought for gets destroyed." Karai's heart raced as she looked at Jane, then back at Makata. The moment hung in the air, suspended by an unbearable tension. She knew Makata's words were true. He had the power, but what he didn't have was Karai's spirit, and the wolves. They would never let her down. With a flick of her wrist, Karai drew her knife and held it out in front of her, her stance steady. The wolves, sensing the danger, closed in tighter, surrounding her and Jane. "I won't leave," Karai said, her voice unwavering. "And you won't win." The wolves snarled, their eyes fierce and determined, their bodies tense. This was more than just a fight for survival now. This was a fight for what was right. Makata hesitated, his mind working rapidly as he assessed the situation. He had thought this would be easy, grab the girl, take the wolves, and crush Karai's resistance. But now, faced with the pack and the steely resolve of the girl, he wasn't so sure. Then, as if in response to Makata's hesitation, one of the wolves let out a single menacing growl. The signal had been given. The first shot rang out, splitting the air with a deafening crack. The gunshot echoed through the ravine, a sharp, cracking sound that sent the wolves into a frenzy. Karai's heart skipped a beat, and she instinctively moved to shield Jane, her body instinctively protecting the girl she had sworn to save. The wolves, sensing the threat in the air, surged forward, their snarls loud and guttural as they positioned themselves between Karai and Makata's men. Makata, momentarily taken aback, cursed under his breath. He hadn't expected the wolves to react so quickly, or for Karai to have the courage to stand firm in the face of his intimidation. But the moment was fleeting. As soon as the shot rang out, Makata's men began to move, reaching for their pistols, their eyes darting from Karai to Jane and back again. The tension in the air was palpable, thick with the promise of violence. Karai knew this was her only chance to end it, or to die trying. She couldn't afford to let Makata take control of this situation. Not now, not after everything. Another shot rang out, narrowly missing Karai's arm, the bullet whizzing past her with a near-deafening hiss. Karai didn't flinch. Instead, she pushed Jane further behind her, stepping into the open, ready to face whatever came next. She could feel the wolves' energy surge, as though they, too, were ready for a fight. Their powerful bodies moved with precision and intent, their muscles coiled tight, ready to strike. Karai's heart raced in her chest, but her mind was calm, focused. She had trained for this, lived for this. Makata's men hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to approach the situation. The wolves were a force to be reckoned with, and they had seen firsthand how fiercely Karai protected the girl. But Makata wasn't one to back down. He was a man who had lived by violence and intimidation for most of his life, and this was no different. "You'll regret this, Karai," Makata called, his voice low and dangerous. He raised his gun, aiming it squarely at her chest, his finger twitching on the trigger. "All of this, it's your fault." Karai didn't move, her grip tightening on her knife, her heart a steady drumbeat in her chest. She had made her choice. The wolves, sensing the danger to their pack, moved in closer, their bodies forming a barrier between her and Makata's men. One by one, they advanced, their eyes glowing in the dim light of the ravine, their movements fluid and controlled. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze. The silence was deafening, broken only by the faintest rustling of the desert wind. And then, as though the very earth beneath them had cracked open, the fight exploded into chaos. Makata fired again, the bullet grazing the edge of Karai's arm. Pain shot through her, but it was nothing compared to the fire in her heart. She wasn't about to let him win. The wolves were upon him in seconds, their teeth flashing in the dim light, their powerful bodies crashing into McCarter's men, forcing them back. The battle was brutal and swift. The wolves tore into the outlaws with primal ferocity, their movements like lightning, sharp and precise. McCarter's men struggled to fight back, but it was clear that they were no match for the wild creatures. Karai, though injured, stood her ground, her knife flashing in the moonlight as she slashed at the men who tried to get too close. It wasn't long before the first of McCarter's men fell, a deep guttural scream echoing through the ravine as a wolf clamped its jaws around his leg. Another man tried to draw his gun, but before he could even raise it, a wolf lunged at his throat, sending him tumbling to the ground. McCarter himself, his face twisted in fury, was still standing, watching the chaos unfold. His gun was still in his hand, but he had no control over the situation. He could see the wolves moving with terrifying precision, their focus solely on tearing his men apart. But he wasn't about to let this be the end. In a sudden, desperate move, McCarter raised his gun again, this time aiming directly at Jane. "Stop!" he shouted, his voice hoarse with panic. "I'll kill her, Karai, if you don't make them stop." Karai's heart skipped a beat. Her eyes locked onto Jane's, the girl's terrified face barely visible behind the wolves. For a brief moment, the world seemed to stand still. The wolves, sensing the shift in energy, paused in their assault, their growls growing softer as they turned to look at Karai. Karai's eyes never left Jane. The girl was too young, too innocent to be dragged into this fight. She had been caught in the crossfire of a war that wasn't hers, and Karai wouldn't let that happen again. "Don't do it, McCarter," Karai said, her voice low but firm. She knew what she had to do. "You don't want to go down this road. Let her go. This is between you and me." McCarter's lips curled into a sneer, but there was doubt in his eyes now. He could see the resolve in Karai's face, the fire in her eyes that told him she would stop at nothing to protect the girl. He was a man used to controlling everything around him, but in that moment he realized he had lost control. "You think you've won?" McCarter spat. "This is just the beginning. You can't hide forever." Karai took a step forward, her voice cold. "This ends tonight." In a flash, the wolves surged forward again, the pack instinctively charging toward McCarter. He tried to raise his gun one last time, but it was too late. The wolves were upon him in an instant, knocking him off his feet, their powerful jaws latching onto him with deadly force. There was no mercy in their eyes. They were fighting for their pack, for the girl who had become their charge. As the chaos subsided, Karai stood over McCarter, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Her body ached from the fight, the wound on her arm throbbing with each passing second, but it didn't matter. McCarter was no longer a threat. For now, the fight was over. The wolves stood by her side, their eyes calm but watchful, their bodies poised in silent readiness. They had protected her. They had protected Jane, and for that, Karai was eternally grateful. But even as the dust began to settle, Karai knew that McCarter's defeat wasn't the end. There were more battles to come. The wolves had given her a temporary victory, but the world outside the ravine was still unforgiving, and somewhere out there, the echoes of the past were still calling. The night was eerily still after the battle, the only sounds the rustling of the desert wind and the low, content growls of the wolves who had returned to their resting positions. Karai stood over the fallen McCarter, his blood staining the dry earth beneath him, but she didn't feel any satisfaction. It wasn't about winning or vengeance, not anymore. She had been caught in a fight not of her making, and now she could only wonder what would come next. The wolves circled her cautiously, their eyes still sharp with the residue of the battle, but their tension had eased. For a brief moment, everything was quiet. Karai looked to Jane, still standing at the edge of the ravine, her rifle now lowered, but her hands still trembling from the terror of the confrontation. Jane's eyes locked with Karai's, but the girl didn't speak. There was nothing to say. The bond between them had been forged in blood, and the gravity of that bond hung heavily in the air between them. Jane had watched as Karai had fought, as the wolves had torn into McCarter's men, and though Karai had protected her, she wondered if Jane could ever truly escape the shadows of violence. "Are you all right?" Karai asked softly, stepping closer to Jane. The girl nodded, though her gaze was distant, her lips pressed tight in a line of fear and confusion. I don't know," Karai understood. It wasn't just fear for her life or the shock of witnessing the carnage. It was the realization that the world she'd known had changed forever. The innocence that Jane had once clung to, the world of peace her father had promised, had been shattered in the span of a few days. Karai walked past Jane, her gaze never leaving McCarter's body. The gang leader lay motionless, the blood seeping into the sand around him, staining the earth with the price of his greed. His men were all but gone, scattered across the ravine. Some barely clinging to life, others nothing more than bodies. The wolves had done their job, and now, in the quiet aftermath, Karai could feel the weight of what had transpired. Jane hesitated before speaking again. Her voice trembled slightly. What happens now? Karai didn't have an answer. She'd hoped that by taking down MacArthur she could end the cycle of violence, but it wasn't that simple. There was no simple solution, not in a world as harsh and unforgiving as theirs. We leave here, Karai said at last, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside. We go where it's safe. We'll figure things out from there. Jane didn't ask where safe was. She knew as well as Karai that there was no place truly safe, not anymore. The wolves had been a shield for them, but nothing could stop the violence of men like MacArthur. It would always find them. As Karai turned to leave, she heard a noise behind her, a rustle in the brush. The wolves tensed, their bodies crouching low, ready for another threat. But it was a man's voice that broke the silence. Karai. She froze. The voice belonged to Thomas Andrews. Her chest tightened and her heart skipped a beat. She had known this moment would come, but she had never imagined it would feel like this. Her mind raced as she turned to face the man who had set all of this into motion, the man who had placed her life in debt. Thomas rode into view, his horse's hooves crunching against the sand. His face was hard, but there was something else there, something softer, like regret. His eyes landed on Jane and a shadow of guilt crossed his features. He hadn't come for revenge. He hadn't come for vengeance. I've been searching for you, Thomas said, his voice rough. I didn't want you to face this alone. Karai felt an anger bubble up inside of her, an anger that had been simmering ever since she had first accepted his gift. She had never wanted to owe him anything. She hadn't asked for his wolves, hadn't asked for his protection. She hadn't asked for any of this. You shouldn't have come, Karai said coldly, her hand instinctively reaching for the knife at her side. This isn't your fight, it never was. Thomas dismounted slowly, holding his hands out in front of him, as if to show he meant no harm. I'm not here to make things worse, I'm here to fix what I can. My daughter, she's not your daughter anymore, Karai interrupted, her voice sharp as a blade. Not after what you did. You used me, Thomas. You gave me wolves as if they were a payment, like I owed you something, like I was your property. Thomas's face twisted with guilt, but he didn't retreat. I wanted to protect you, both of you, and when MacArthur threatened Jane, you don't understand, Karai snapped. You can't protect anyone with wolves or gifts. People like MacArthur don't care about honor or gifts. They don't care about anything but power. A tense silence hung between them, but Thomas didn't flinch. Instead, he looked past Karai, his eyes landing on Jane. I'm sorry, he said quietly, his voice laced with regret. I've been a fool. I tried to fix things, but I see now I can't make it right with just wolves. Make it. It's too late for that. Karai didn't respond right away. She wanted to scream at him to tell him how he had failed them both, but she saw the truth in his eyes. The broken man who had been searching for redemption in all the wrong places. The wolves, sensing the tension, stepped forward. Their low growls a reminder that they were not easily dismissed. Karai took a deep breath, her hand falling from the knife, and gave him one last look. I'll go, she said softly, but you won't stop me from protecting her. Not now, not ever. And with that, Karai turned, her heart still heavy, but her resolve unwavering. The desert stretched before them, endless and unforgiving, and the wolves followed close behind. Thomas stood in the distance, the weight of his decisions heavy on his shoulders, as he watched the two girls, the one he had failed and the one he had tried to protect, disappear into the horizon. The sun was just beginning to rise over the mountains as Karai and Jane made their way deeper into the desert. The wolves followed closely, their eyes ever watchful, their movements as fluid as the wind that swept across the barren landscape. Karai had always known this life, the life of survival in the wilderness. But now, with Jane at her side, she was beginning to understand something new, the weight of responsibility. The girl, once innocent and sheltered, had seen things no child should ever witness, and Karai knew that, no matter where they went, the echoes of the past would always follow them. Jane didn't speak much during the journey. She was too lost in her own thoughts, her mind still reeling from the events that had unfolded. She had lost her home, her father's promises, and her safety. She had seen violence that left a mark on her soul, and now she had to find a way to move forward. But how could she? In her heart, she wasn't sure who to trust anymore, the father who had promised her protection, or the girl who had saved her life at a cost. Are you okay? Karai asked quietly, her voice carrying just enough for Jane to hear over the wind. Jane didn't answer right away. Her gaze was fixed ahead, her face a mask of exhaustion and sorrow. Finally, she turned to Karai, her eyes filled with confusion. "I don't know," she admitted. "I don't know how to be okay. I don't know what to do now." Karai nodded, understanding the depth of Jane's pain. It was a burden no one her age should have to carry, but there was no turning back. The world they lived in didn't care about innocence or age. It only cared about survival. "We keep moving," Karai said simply. "We find a place to rest, and then we keep going, one day at a time." Jane didn't reply, but she followed Karai's lead. She had no choice. Karai had become her protector, her guide, and she wasn't sure where she would go without her. The silence between them was thick, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that came when two souls, broken by the same world, walked side by side with no need for words. The wolves too were quiet, their steady presence a reminder that they were all in this together. Karai had never known loyalty like this, not from men, and certainly not from the land itself. But the wolves had proven themselves time and again. They would not abandon her. They would not abandon Jane. As they traveled, the landscape around them changed. The once endless stretch of sand and rock began to give way to scrubland and sparse vegetation. The air grew hotter and the dust thicker, but Karai kept her focus, her eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of danger. She knew that Makata's death hadn't erased the danger they faced. It had only stirred the hornet's nest. Others like him, men hungry for power and control, would be drawn to the scent of blood. By mid-afternoon, the heat of the desert had taken its toll on them. Karai found a small rock outcrop, a natural shelter from the harsh sun, and motioned for Jane to sit. She crouched next to her, checking the water supply. They had enough to last a few days, but Karai knew it wouldn't be long before they'd need more. The vast, unforgiving desert didn't care for the weak or the weary. As Jane sat in the shade, her eyes distant and troubled, Karai allowed herself a moment of quiet reflection. She had made choices that had led them here, choices that had changed everything. But no matter what, she couldn't let herself falter. Not now. Not when Jane needed her the most. Jane's voice broke through her thoughts, soft but steady. "Do you ever wish you had a different life?" Karai turned to her, surprised by the question. It wasn't something she'd ever asked herself. The life she had known, the life of survival, of constant movement and fleeting moments of peace, had never left room for regret. But she saw something in Jane's eyes now, a longing for something more, a longing for the kind of life she had lost. "I don't know if wishing does any good," Karai said carefully, her voice low. "I think maybe we all have a life we're meant to live. It's not always the life we want, but it's the one we get, and we do what we can to survive it." Jane's gaze softened, and she nodded slowly. "Do you ever think about what comes next?" Karai took a deep breath, looking up at the vast expanse of the desert stretching before them. There was nothing but open land and the endless sky. No signs of civilization, no sign of hope, but she couldn't let that consume her. "I don't know," Karai admitted, her voice barely a whisper, "but I know we can't stop. We have to keep moving forward. We can't let the past catch up with us." Jane stayed quiet for a long time, her gaze shifting toward the horizon. The wind tugged at her hair, but she didn't seem to notice. Finally, she spoke again, her voice barely audible. "Do you think we'll ever be safe?" The question hung in the air like a heavy weight, one that neither of them could truly answer. But Karai didn't look away. She knew Jane was asking something deeper, something more than just the physical danger they faced. It was a question about the future, about finding peace in a world that seemed intent on tearing everything apart. "I don't know," Karai said quietly, "but I'll make sure we try." The two girls sat in silence, the wolves resting by their sides. They weren't safe, not yet, and maybe they never would be. But in this moment, under the shelter of the rocks and the vast sky above, there was something else, a quiet understanding that they were in this together, and that was enough for now. The world outside would continue to press in, and the dangers they faced would only grow. But as the sun began to set, casting the desert in a golden light, Karai and Jane shared a small, fragile hope. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep them moving forward. The night was still far from over, and the road ahead was uncertain. But at least, for now, they were not alone. The desert night settled in, cooler now, but the air still thick with tension. Karai and Jane slept under the stars, their bodies exhausted, their minds too restless for true rest. The wolves lay at their feet, their eyes watchful and ever alert, a silent reminder that they weren't as safe as the dark night might suggest. But Karai didn't need to sleep, not yet. Not when there was so much uncertainty still hanging in the air, waiting to pull them under. She lay awake, her gaze fixed on the sky, the stars twinkling like distant promises. She wondered, as she often did, about the world beyond this endless stretch of wilderness, She had known the land, the dust, the danger for most of her life. But Jane had known something else, something she had lost in an instant: safety, family, and a future that didn't involve running, hiding, or fighting for survival. The girl was far too young to be carrying this weight. The crackling of the fire punctuated the silence, a small but constant sound against the backdrop of the night stillness. Karai rolled onto her side, keeping her voice low so as not to disturb Jane's sleep. "We need to find water tomorrow," Karai murmured, though she wasn't speaking to Jane. The wolves stirred briefly, their ears perking up at her words, but they remained quiet. Even they could sense the weight of the world pressing in on them. Suddenly a sound pierced the night, a rustling in the bushes just beyond the firelight. Karai's muscles tensed, and she slowly rose to her feet, her senses on high alert. The wolves were already moving, low growls escaping their throats as they positioned themselves around Jane. Karai's hand went to the knife at her side, the familiar weight reassuring in her palm. She stepped forward cautiously, her eyes scanning the shadows, the darkness hiding whatever was out there. For a moment, there was nothing, only the wind and the sounds of the night. Then a figure stepped into view, slowly emerging from the shadows. It was a man. He was tall, with a weathered face and a hard, quiet demeanor. His eyes were sharp, but there was no hostility in his gaze, only weariness. His clothes were torn from the rough desert winds, his boots caked in dust from days of travel. He had the look of a man who had been on the run for far too long. Karai didn't lower her guard. She had learned the hard way not to trust anyone, especially not strangers in the desert. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice as cold as the desert night. The man raised his hands in a peaceful gesture, taking a step closer, but he kept his distance. "I mean no harm," he said, his voice low with an accent that was hard to place. "I'm just passing through." Karai's eyes narrowed. There was something off about him, something she couldn't quite place, but her instincts screamed that he wasn't just passing through. "I don't believe you," she said, her hand still on her knife, her posture tense. The man hesitated, as if weighing his words carefully. "I know about you, and about McCarter." At the mention of McCarter, Karai's blood ran cold. She didn't speak immediately, but her mind raced. How could anyone know about McCarter, about what had happened? "I don't want trouble," the man continued, his eyes darting to the sleeping Jane and then back to Karai. "I've seen the blood on your hands. I know you fought McCarter's men. I don't have a dog in this fight, but if you're heading west, there's something you need to know." Karai's grip on her knife tightened, but she didn't move. The wolves, the D, too, were watching intently, their eyes locked onto the stranger as if waiting for him to make his next move. "And what's that?" Karai asked, her voice sharper now. Every instinct told her to keep him at a distance, trust no one. But the man's presence wasn't a random occurrence. There was something familiar about him, and that made her uneasy. The man took another step forward, lowering his voice even more. "There's a bounty on your head, on both of you." The words hit Karai like a physical blow. She froze, her mind racing. A bounty? On her and Jane? Who would? "The whole region knows what you did to McCarter," the man said, sensing her confusion. "Word's been spreading. It's not just him you have to worry about anymore. His allies, the men he worked with, they won't stop until they find you." Karai's chest tightened. She had known that McCarter's death wouldn't go unnoticed, but a bounty. That meant every bounty hunter, outlaw, and opportunist in the region would be hunting them. She couldn't outrun that. Not forever. "Who are you?" Karai demanded, her voice low and threatening now. "Why are you telling me this?" The man finally dropped his hands, his expression softer. "I'm not your enemy," he said quietly. "But I've got a way out of here, a place up north, safe. For a while, at least. No one will find you there." Karai's mind raced. He could be lying, he probably was. But a place where they could rest, where they could hide. It sounded like a dream, one she couldn't afford to ignore. "How do I know I can trust you?" she asked, her voice steady, but tinged with doubt. The man paused for a long moment, then pulled something from his coat pocket, a worn, weathered piece of paper. He handed it to Karai without a word. She unfolded it carefully, and her eyes scanned the page. It was a map, hand-drawn, with markings indicating a path leading to the north. At the bottom, there was a symbol she recognized, a safe house, a place where people like them could disappear, at least for a time. But it was also a place many had come to regret seeking out. Karai lowered the map slowly. "I'm not asking for your help," she said, but the words felt hollow as they left her lips. The wolves growled softly in the background, sensing the tension. "I'm not asking for yours," the man replied, his voice unwavering, "but I'm giving you a choice. Head west with a target on your back, or take this chance. The choice is yours." The wind picked up, swirling around them, carrying with it the scent of the desert, a scent that would haunt Karai's every step. The man stood there watching her closely, his face unreadable, and for the first time in a long while, Karai felt the weight of the world press down on her again. The road ahead was uncertain, the dangers more real than ever. But in that moment, as the firelight flickered and the wolves stood guard, Karai knew one thing for certain: she couldn't do this alone. "Where's this place?" she asked, finally breaking the silence. The man nodded, his eyes sharp with understanding. "Follow me," he said. Karai glanced at Jane, still asleep, then back at the stranger. She knew the risks, but in this world, survival was never about playing it safe. They had no choice but to follow the path ahead. Karai had always been a lone wolf. The thought of trusting a stranger, much less following him to a supposed safe house, was enough to send a cold shiver down her spine. But as she stared at the man, the gravity of their situation began to settle in. Makata's men were only the beginning. The bounty on her head, the danger that was closing in, was real, and it was only a matter of time before others came looking. She glanced at Jane, still sleeping peacefully despite the chaos that had just unfolded. For a brief moment, Karai envied the girl's innocence, the way she could rest without the weight of survival pressing on her chest. But that was gone now. Jane had seen too much, had lived too much of the brutality of the world. There was no going back for either of them. "You're making a mistake," Karai said quietly, her voice almost a whisper. "Following me means more danger, more bloodshed. You don't know what you're getting into." The man didn't flinch. He simply took a step closer, his eyes steady and full of quiet certainty. "I know what I'm getting into. I've lived it, and I'm offering you a chance to escape it, at least for a while." Karai felt the tension in her shoulders tighten. She wasn't used to relying on anyone, especially not a man with eyes as sharp as his, a man who knew too much about her past. But as she stared down at the map in her hand, the hand-drawn lines leading to the north, to a place she couldn't even be sure existed, she realized she had no other choice. "Fine," Karai said, her voice firm, "but if this is a trap, I'll end it before you can even blink." The man nodded, as though he expected nothing less. "Fair enough." She turned toward Jane, who was now stirring in her sleep, the peaceful look on her face slowly melting into the reality of their situation. Karai hesitated for a moment before gently shaking her shoulder, careful not to wake her too abruptly. "Jane," Karai said softly, "we're moving out. We have to go." Jane's eyes fluttered open, the remnants of sleep still clinging to her. She blinked up at Karai, confusion clouding her expression before recognition set in. The weight of everything that had happened seemed to hit her all at once. "Where are we going?" Jane asked, her voice still hoarse with sleep. Karai hesitated, but only for a moment. "We're heading north. There's a place, somewhere safe. We need to get there before it's too late." Jane didn't ask any more questions. She simply nodded and stood up, brushing the dust from her clothes. Karai felt a pang of guilt. The girl had been through enough. She didn't deserve this life. But there was no turning back now. The man, whose name Karai still didn't know, stood a few paces away, his eyes scanning the horizon. He had no intention of waiting. The urgency of their situation was clear in his movements, and Karai could feel the tension in the air. Time was running out. "We leave now," the man said, already turning toward the desert. "We move fast." Karai followed without a word, her footsteps steady but filled with uncertainty. The wolves trailed closely behind, their low growls punctuating the silence as they moved through the night. There was no moon now, only the distant stars and the crushing weight of the desert stretching out before them. The air was cool, the chill of the night creeping into her bones. The darkness around them seemed alive, the shifting dunes and rocky outcrops offering no real protection. Karai knew that this was only the beginning. The bounty on her head had already started to spread, and now, with Makata out of the picture, the men who had worked with him would be hunting her. As they walked, the man's form slowly faded into the shadows ahead of them, his steps sure and confident. Karai's eyes flickered toward Jane, who kept a few paces behind her, her face still drawn with fear, confusion, and the weight of everything that had happened. She didn't speak, but Karai knew what she was thinking. Was this truly the best choice? Was the danger worth the hope of safety? Was there even such a thing as safety in their world? They walked for what felt like hours, the oppressive heat of the day still hanging in the air, even though the sun was no longer up. Every now and then, Karai would glance back at Jane, watching the girl's weary expression, her exhaustion clear. But there was something else there too, something darker. Something that came with the knowledge that they were both trapped in this world, one that didn't offer mercy, only survival. Finally, as the first light of dawn began to break, casting long shadows across the desert, the man stopped. He turned to them, his face unreadable, but his eyes were sharp, scanning the distance as though expecting someone to be watching. "Keep close," he said, his voice low. "We'll make camp here for the day. It's safer than trying to move in the light. The bounty hunters, they'll be out soon, and you don't want them catching your trail." Karai nodded, but inside a pit of dread settled in her stomach. They had already lost so much, and now they were forced into hiding like animals. She glanced around, her senses alert. There was no way to know if this man was telling the truth or if this was some kind of trap. She had no way of knowing if they were truly safe or just walking into the jaws of something worse. But in this world there were no guarantees, only choices. The man set to work quickly, building a small fire and making them a simple meal. Karai and Jane sat near the edge of the camp, the heat of the desert sun rising higher with each passing moment. As the morning dragged on, Karai allowed herself a moment to breathe. The silence of the desert was overwhelming, and for the first time since everything had started, she allowed herself to feel the weight of the choices she had made. She had put herself and Jane in danger for the promise of safety. But was it enough? And when would it be enough? She looked over at Jane, who was sitting silently by the fire, her face in the shadows, her thoughts just as tangled and heavy as Karai's own. They were both walking into the unknown, hoping that somewhere, somehow, there was a way out. But that was the thing about hope in the desert. It was fleeting. And so, they waited. The heat of the day bore down on the desert with unrelenting force, the sun high in the sky, a burning reminder of the harsh world they inhabited. Karai sat on a large rock, watching the horizon as her thoughts spun like the winds that swept across the barren landscape. She kept her distance from the man who had brought them here, her mind on the dangers that lay ahead, but her attention never wavered from Jane, who sat by the fire staring into the flames. The air was thick with the smell of smoke and the ever-present dust, but it wasn't the dust that worried Karai. It was the unease gnawing at her gut, the growing suspicion that they had stepped into something far more dangerous than they could see. She had felt it the moment they arrived. The man with his quiet demeanor, his sudden knowledge of Makata's gang, and his promise of safety, all of it reeked of a plan she couldn't quite figure out. And yet, they had no choice but to trust him. For now, Jane, still too young to fully grasp the weight of their situation, seemed to drift in and out of awareness. She would ask questions sometimes about where they were going or what they would do when they got there, but Karai never had the answers. She had never known a world where answers came easy, where life could be controlled. And this desert, it didn't care about answers. It didn't. It only cared about survival. After some time, the man, whose name Karai had still yet to learn, finished preparing a simple meal and walked over to where Karai sat. His boots crunched on the gravel as he approached, and Karai couldn't help but notice the weariness in his eyes, as though he carried the weight of 100 miles behind him. "We'll move out soon," he said, his voice steady. While it's still light enough to travel without drawing attention, Karai nodded, but didn't speak. She wasn't sure what to make of his urgency. She had seen too many men like him, men who moved through the world with a quiet, dangerous purpose, and it made her wary. She had learned the hard way to trust only what could be seen, only what was in front of her. The rest was always a lie. "How long until we reach this safe place?" she asked, her tone sharp but controlled. The man hesitated for a moment, his gaze flicking to the fire. "A couple more days, maybe 3. It's not far, but we'll need to keep moving fast. The bounty's spreading, and it won't be long before someone picks up your trail." Karai felt the knot in her stomach tighten. A couple of days? She didn't like the sound of that. The desert wasn't a place to take your time. It was a place where the weak didn't survive, where the land could swallow you whole without a second thought. As if on cue, Jane looked up from the fire, her face still pale, her body thin from too many days on the run. Her eyes met Karai's, filled with a mix of exhaustion and curiosity. "Are we really safe here?" Karai met her gaze, her lips pressing into a thin line. The truth was, she didn't know. She didn't know if any place could be safe for them anymore, but she couldn't tell Jane that. Not now. Not when the girl had already been through so much. "We're safe for now," Karai said, offering a small, reassuring smile, even if she didn't believe it herself. "But we need to keep moving. We'll be out of here soon." Jane nodded, though it was clear she wasn't entirely convinced. She didn't speak again, choosing instead to stare into the fire, her small hands clenched in her lap. The man had begun to pack up their things, securing their supplies, and preparing for the long day of travel ahead. Karai stayed by the fire for a moment longer, her thoughts heavy on the path they were taking. The desert was unforgiving, but it wasn't just the land she feared. It was the people, the men who would stop at nothing to collect the bounty on their heads, the men who would see them as nothing more than prey. And then from the distance, a sound cut through the silence. It was a faint noise at first, almost indistinguishable from the wind, but then it grew louder, more distinct. Karai's heart skipped a beat as her instincts flared to life. It was the unmistakable sound of hooves. The man turned sharply, his face hardening as he scanned the horizon. "They're here," he muttered under his breath. "Bounty hunters." Karai's pulse quickened. There was no time to waste. "Get ready," she said to Jane, her voice sharp with urgency. The girl looked up, her wide eyes full of confusion, but Karai didn't wait for a response. She grabbed Jane's arm, pulling her to her feet. The man was already strapping his gun to his side, his movements quick and sure. "We need to move now. They're too close." The wolves, sensing the tension, began to growl low, their bodies tensing as they circled around Jane and Karai. Karai pulled Jane close, her heart pounding in her chest as she watched the approaching riders grow nearer. "Can you fight?" Karai asked the man, her eyes narrowing. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned to face her, his expression grim. "I can. But you need to move faster than them. There's a hidden trail behind that rock outcrop," he said, pointing to a nearby hill. "Take it. We'll hold them off for as long as we can." Karai didn't need to hear any more. She grabbed Jane's hand and started toward the outcrop, her feet light but purposeful. The wolves followed close behind, their eyes glowing in the dimming light. The sound of hooves grew louder. It wasn't long before the first of the riders came into view, their figures outlined against the setting sun. There were at least 4 of them, all heavily armed, their faces masked by shadows. They had found them. Karai's heart raced. She could hear the man behind her yelling orders as he prepared to defend their position. But her focus was on the trail, the narrow, winding path that could lead them to safety, if they could reach it in time. The wolves, once again, moved in front of her and Jane, growling menacingly as they sensed the riders getting closer. It was a race against time, one she didn't know if they would win. "Keep moving," Karai hissed, her voice low but urgent. "Don't look back." And as they ran, the dust from the riders' hooves filled the air, the horizon disappearing behind a wall of red and orange. The desert, relentless and ever-shifting, would be the backdrop to another fight for survival. The wind whipped through the desert, carrying with it the scent of dust and desperation. Karai's heart thundered in her chest as she pulled Jane along, her grip tight on the girl's hand, urging her to keep pace. The wolves were with them, their presence comforting, yet unnerving, as they bounded forward, their eyes alert, every muscle poised for the inevitable confrontation. Karai didn't dare look back. She couldn't afford to. If they were going to survive this, they had to keep moving. Behind them, the sounds of the bounty hunters grew louder. Their horses galloped toward them, stirring up the dust and echoing in the vast emptiness of the desert. Karai could feel the heat of the chase burning into her skin, the danger closing in. Every step she took felt like it could be her last. "We're almost there," Karai muttered, her voice strained as she pushed forward. She glanced over her shoulder briefly, just enough to see the riders approaching faster, their faces hidden by scarves and wide-brimmed hats. The lead rider raised his gun, and Karai's stomach lurched. The wolves reacted immediately, growling in unison, their bodies tensing as they took up defensive positions around her and Jane. "Keep running, Jane! Now!" Karai barked, pulling the girl with her as they veered off the main path toward the rocky outcrop. The terrain was uneven, rocky and sharp, but it was their only chance. If they could reach the narrow pass ahead, they might be able to lose the riders in the maze of jagged rocks. The wolves took point, charging ahead with unmatched speed and agility, their fangs bared and eyes glowing with predatory intent. Karai could hear the riders shouting behind them. Spurred on by the scent of fear and the promise of a bounty, she forced herself not to think about it. Fear was a luxury they couldn't afford. They reached the narrow pass. It was a tight squeeze, but it would shield them for a moment. Karai ducked down, pulling Jane along with her. The wolves flanked them, crouching low, their fur blending with the rocks, their bodies perfectly still. They could hear the riders now, their horses stopping at the entrance of the pass. Karai's pulse quickened as she crouched in the shadows, praying the bounty hunters wouldn't spot them. For a long moment there was only silence. Then the voice of the lead rider broke through the stillness. "They're here somewhere, they didn't get far, look for their trail." The riders dismounted, their heavy boots crunching against the ground. Karai's heart beat louder in her chest, but she forced herself to stay still, barely daring to breathe. Jane too remained quiet, her small body trembling beside her. "They've got wolves with them," another rider muttered, his voice tense. "We can't go in there without a fight. They'll rip us apart." The first rider cursed under his breath. "Then we wait them out. They can't stay hidden forever. We'll starve them out or force them to come out." Karai felt a wave of nausea rise in her throat. They were trapped, and the hunters were closing in. There was no way out of the pass except forward, but that would lead them right into the open desert, where they'd be exposed. And the wolves, as fierce and loyal as they were, couldn't protect them forever. "We can't stay here," Karai whispered, her eyes scanning the narrow passage. "We need to move." Quietly, she motioned for Jane to stay low, and they moved silently, the wolves leading the way, their instincts guiding them through the rocky maze. Karai's breath came in shallow gasps as they slipped through the craggy rocks. Each step calculated and deliberate. There was no room for error. As they moved deeper into the passage, the sound of the bounty hunters' voices faded behind them, but the tension didn't lift. They still had to keep moving. "Karai," Jane whispered, her voice small and unsure. "What happens if we can't outrun them? What if they find us?" Karai's heart tightened. She didn't have an answer for the girl. She couldn't promise her safety, not in a world like this. But she could promise one thing. She would never stop fighting for her. "We'll keep running," Karai said firmly, her voice low but filled with conviction. "We'll fight and we'll survive no matter what." The wolves, sensing Karai's resolve, moved faster, urging her forward. Their eyes glowed in the dark, a constant reminder that they were not alone. Karai kept her focus, pushing herself and Jane through the pass until the path began to open up into a wider expanse of rocky terrain. But as they emerged from the pass, the sound of hooves reached her ears again, this time closer than before. She cursed under her breath. The riders had found another way around. "Stay close," Karai hissed, pulling Jane into the cover of a small outcrop of rocks. "We'll have to fight our way out." She turned to the wolves, their bodies poised and ready for the confrontation. Karai's heart pounded in her chest, the adrenaline surging through her veins. She didn't want to fight. She didn't want to kill. But the desert didn't care about what she wanted. It only cared about survival. The riders emerged from the other side of the rocks, their faces hidden behind scarves, their hands resting on the butts of their guns. Karai's grip on her knife tightened as she prepared for the inevitable. The wolves growled low, their hackles raised as they sized up the riders. "Stay back," Karai warned, her voice steady but dangerous. She didn't have the luxury of mercy. She didn't have time to negotiate. The lead rider sneered. "You're surrounded, girl, it's over." Karai didn't flinch. "Not yet." With a swift motion, she signaled the wolves. In an instant, they were upon the riders, faster than any human could react, their jaws snapping and teeth bared. The bounty hunters tried to draw their weapons, but the wolves were too quick. In the chaos that followed, Karai fought like a blur, her knife flashing in the dying light, her movements as fluid as the wolves' own. She couldn't stop to think about the lives she was taking. She couldn't afford to, not when Jane was watching. When the last of the riders fell, the silence that followed was deafening. Karai stood among the bodies, her chest heaving with exhaustion, her hands trembling from the effort. The wolves returned to her side, their eyes calm but alert, as if waiting for her next command. Jane stood behind her, her small hands clenched into fists, her wide eyes fixed on the aftermath of the fight. Did we win?" she asked, her voice small and uncertain. Karai looked down at the girl, the weight of their situation crashing over her in that moment. She didn't have an answer. "We survive," Karai said softly, her voice barely a whisper, and that for now was all they could do. The desert stretched before them, its vast emptiness both a haven and a graveyard. The sun had begun its descent, casting long shadows across the rocky landscape. Karai stood still, her eyes scanning the horizon, searching for any sign of movement. The battle with the bounty hunters was over, but the tension in the air was far from gone. The fight had been brutal, and though they had emerged victorious, Karai knew that each step they took only led them deeper into a world that was unforgiving, unrelenting. The wolves, their bodies still bristling with adrenaline, moved in close around Karai and Jane. Their sharp eyes remained alert, ever watchful, sensing the uncertainty that lingered in the air. Karai turned to Jane, whose face was pale but resolute, the events of the past days written clearly in the set of her jaw. Jane had witnessed it all, the violence, the fear, the choice to fight. But now, there was silence. "We need to keep moving," Karai said, her voice steady, though it wavered slightly under the weight of everything she had carried for so long. Jane looked up at her, a deep sadness in her eyes. "Where do we go now, Karai?" Her voice trembled despite her attempt at strength. "Where can we be safe?" Karai's heart ached at the question. The truth was, there was no place where they could truly be safe. Not in this world, not with the choices they had made. She had always been a wanderer, a survivor, but now with Jane at her side, the stakes were higher. She couldn't just think about survival anymore. She had to think about Jane's future, her life. "There's a place up north," Karai said after a long pause, her voice almost a whisper. "It's not far. Maybe it'll be safe for a time." Jane didn't respond immediately. She just nodded, as if the weight of their journey had finally caught up with her. Karai couldn't blame her. They had been running, hiding, fighting for so long. that Jane's innocence had been stripped away with each passing day. But even in the face of all that, there was a spark of something left in the girl. Hope, maybe, or the remnants of it. Karai couldn't take that from her. Not yet. As they moved forward, the landscape around them began to change. The jagged rocks gave way to more open terrain, and the harshness of the desert seemed to soften, just slightly. It was a fragile peace, one that Karai knew wouldn't last. But for now, it was enough. The man who had led them here, the one with the map, the stranger who had become an unlikely guide, had vanished into the night after the fight with the bounty hunters. His true intentions remained unclear. Had he really meant to help them, or had he simply been another player in this dangerous game? Karai had no answers, but she had Jane, and that was something. And they made camp in a small ravine, hidden from view, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Karai allowed herself to rest. The fire was small, crackling softly, its warmth a brief comfort against the cold desert night. Jane curled up beside her, the weight of exhaustion pulling at her small frame. Karai watched her, her heart heavy with the knowledge that she couldn't protect Jane from everything. She could keep her alive, could shield her from harm for now, but the world was too cruel to offer much more than that. When Jane fell asleep, Karai stayed awake, staring into the fire. The shadows danced on the walls of the ravine, twisting and turning in ways that mirrored her thoughts. She had come so far, fought so hard, and yet the journey ahead was still uncertain. Every choice she made seemed to lead to another sacrifice, another battle, and now, as she sat alone with her thoughts, Karai knew the truth. No matter how many times she fought, no matter how many men she killed or wolves she tamed, she could never escape the past. It would follow her always. The echoes of Makata, the gang, the blood that had been spilled, they would haunt her, like ghosts in the wind. But for Jane, she would keep fighting. She would survive, and she would make sure that the girl would never have to become like her. That was the only choice that mattered. The fire flickered out, leaving only the quiet darkness around them. Karai took a deep breath, her thoughts solidifying into something more. She didn't know what the future held. She didn't know if there was any true safety left for them, but she would protect Jane, whatever it took. As the night stretched on, Karai's eyes flickered toward the horizon once more. The desert was silent, but it wasn't empty. The world was watching, and it would always demand a price. But for now, Karai had what she needed. She had a chance to build something for Jane, a future that wasn't filled with violence, but with the possibility of peace, however fleeting. As the stars above blinked softly in the vast expanse of sky, Karai knew that this was the beginning of something new. The road ahead was long, and the desert unforgiving. But for the first time, she felt that it was worth walking. They had made it this far, and for now that was enough.
When the smoke clears and the bodies fall, only silence remains. If this story touched you, subscribe, because in the West, nothing stays buried for long.